Have you ever wondered what would happen if half the world decided to ditch the dollar? What if I told you we're witnessing the beginning of exactly that right now? The world is witnessing an unprecedented phenomenon. 44 countries from Asia to Africa, from Latin America to the Middle East, are simultaneously knocking on the door of an alliance no one invited them to join. Not NATO, not G7, but BRICS. A bloc once viewed as a faint symbol now becoming a geopolitical magnet that even Washington must reckon with. Is this just another economic club forming, or are we watching the foundations of the Western-led financial order begin to crumble in real time? And most importantly, should America be worried when the very system of freedom they built is being voluntarily abandoned by countries that once followed their lead? Ready to have your worldview challenged? Drop a comment if you're brave enough to question everything you thought you knew about global power. In this video, we'll decode the entire power shift taking place from the historic Rio summit to the invisible hands orchestrating from behind. Each section will reveal secrets mainstream media doesn't want you to know. Stay until the end, because if you miss this, you might miss an entire new chapter of world history. The geopolitical storm begins. Most of the world has grown accustomed to a global financial order where the West, led by the United States, shapes the rules, allocates resources, and decides who gets to speak. But stepping into 2025, the cracks in that system are becoming increasingly evident. Think about it. What would make nearly a quarter of the world's nations suddenly want to join the same club? Coincidence? Or calculated rebellion? At a moment when power imbalances have left many nations feeling excluded, another door is opening, and it's called BRICS. A geopolitical storm is forming, and at its center is a staggering number. 44 countries, more than one-fifth of all nations on Earth, are either expressing interest or formally applying to join the BRICS alliance. Of these, 23 countries have submitted official applications, while 21 others have made exploratory moves or public declarations of interest. This is no longer a theoretical concept. It's an accelerating real-world wave laying the foundation for a new world order where power isn't concentrated in the hands of a few superpowers. Even more noteworthy is that these expressions of interest aren't coming from weak or unstable countries. The list includes powerfully emerging economies in Africa, resource-rich nations in the Middle East, major producers in Asia, and even some governments previously considered closely aligned with the Western axis. Many Southeast Asian countries have also begun reconsidering their strategic orientation, including Vietnam. Though without an official declaration, Vietnam's name has appeared in global discussions as a candidate that could bring many surprises. Some analysts point out that if Hanoi truly considers this move, it would be a logical continuation of the multidirectional and independent foreign policy that Vietnam has persistently pursued for decades. But what has caused so many countries to simultaneously pivot toward BRICS? This isn't simply a race to join an economic organization. It's a clear signal that many countries want to escape dependence on Western financial institutions like the IMF or World Bank, places where loans typically come with stringent binding conditions, from policy reforms to economic model adjustments. In BRICS, they see a different path, where they're not monitored but treated as true partners who are listened to and share benefits on the global chessboard. Unlike NATO or G7, blocs built on invitation, persuasion, or even pressure to expand, BRICS is experiencing the opposite. Countries voluntarily knock on the door and in many cases knock a second or third time. This demonstrates that the alliance's appeal doesn't come from propaganda campaigns but from disappointment with the current system and hope for a substantial alternative. Notably, today's BRICS is no longer the original five-nation group. It has evolved, expanded, and changed not just in quantity but in the quality of its members. This causes other countries to view BRICS not as a symbol but as a strategic tool, a practical option to reposition themselves in the global economy. The spread of this wave isn't happening randomly. It has patterns, pace, and is creating changes that could shake the balance of world power in the coming decade. Observers note that 2025 could go down in history as the moment BRICS transitions from a potential alliance to a force shaping a new global order. How many of you can name even 10 of the 44 countries waiting to join BRICS? Comment below if you think you know which major players are leading the charge. But this is just the surface. Behind the wave of BRICS membership spreading globally is a much deeper story. A story about a change in strategic thinking, in economic influence networks, and in how countries build alliances to survive in a world that's no longer as stable as before. Inside the historic Rio meeting. Now, let's turn our attention to what many observers are calling a turning point in the global economic order, the BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro this July. In a world where conferences are often merely ceremonial and joint statements are forgotten after a few headlines, this event is completely different. It's being compared to a closed session where the fate of 44 countries will be decided. And beyond that, this could be the moment when BRICS stops existing as a defensive alliance against Western pressure and becomes an entity actively reshaping global rules. Let me ask you this. What happens when countries controlling over half the world's population and resources decide they no longer need the dollar? Is the world ready for what comes next? In Rio, the current 10-member countries, including powers like China, India, Russia, and rising names like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Ethiopia, will not just sit down to assess who deserves to enter the BRICS common house. They'll face bigger questions. Should BRICS continue unlimited expansion or tighten to maintain consensus? Will new members have equal voting rights? And most importantly, should BRICS begin to act as a unified economic bloc like G7 once did? Because if they agree to take another step from a loose group to a bloc with common strategy, common voice, and possibly even a common currency, BRICS will no longer be an alternative choice. It will become a real competitor to the Western-led financial system. That would not only change global capital flows but challenge the soft power of organizations like the IMF, World Bank, or even the dominant position of the US dollar. Therefore, the atmosphere ahead of the Rio conference is far from simple. Negotiations are taking place not just among the 10 current members but also with groups of countries waiting outside the fence. There are groups like West African countries, Middle Eastern nations, and even some Latin American economies previously heavily influenced by Washington now quietly negotiating in clusters to increase their weight. BRICS is no longer just a collection of independent countries. It's evolving into an ecosystem where regional clusters come together to enter the global playing field through a new model. In particular, this conference could be an opportunity for member countries to discuss more seriously building a separate payment system independent of SWIFT, the system long controlled by the West. Some countries like China and Russia have already begun experimenting with payment models using domestic currencies. Some oil transactions have even been conducted outside the USD scope. But if BRICS formalizes this into a collective policy, it will be a direct statement. We don't need the dollar to exist and develop. However, the issue isn't just technical or systemic. The biggest challenge lies within BRICS itself. Old and new members have different histories, different political systems, and even opposing strategic interests. China and India still have border disputes. Russia is confronting the West, while Brazil and South Africa are trying to maintain neutral positions. This makes unifying a common voice more difficult than ever. Yet it's precisely this paradox that creates value for BRICS, a genuinely multipolar model, not bound by a single power axis. Each country can maintain its identity, maintain sovereignty, and still find common ground in a larger goal: building a fairer world in terms of resource distribution, development opportunities, and the right to participate in the global system. Real talk. Isn't it ironic that the anti-Western alliance might actually be more democratic in its structure than the supposedly democratic institutions of the West? Analysts predict that even if the Rio conference doesn't produce a complete list of new members, if just half of the 44 waiting countries are admitted, BRICS will immediately become the world's largest economic bloc in terms of population, resources, and production capacity. This is no longer fantasy. It's a transition that could occur within months. And if this Rio conference truly marks that turning point, history will look back at 2025 as the moment when BRICS stopped being a reaction to the Western-controlled world and became action, a strategic action that could shape the financial, commercial, and geopolitical future of the entire world. The evolution, from 5 nations to global power. Now, to truly understand what we're witnessing, we need to take a step back. Perhaps few remember that the name BRICS was once just an academic concept, an acronym proposed by an economist at Goldman Sachs in the early 2000s to describe 4 developing economies with great potential: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. South Africa later joined, and the name BRICS officially became a group. But it took many years for this bloc to truly transform from a symbol of growth opportunity to an organization with real power on the global chessboard. Have you noticed how the media downplayed BRICS for years until they couldn't ignore it anymore? Ask yourself why that might be. Initially, BRICS was just seen as a meeting place for large countries not yet strong enough to compete with G7 nations with voices but never invited to the main table. Summit meetings during that period were largely symbolic, with statements more diplomatic in color than practical action. But what has happened in recent years, especially after the pandemic, energy crisis, and the war in Ukraine, has completely changed the role and nature of BRICS. No longer a group of 5 individual countries, BRICS has now become 10 nations, and that change isn't just numerical but a sign of a strategic turning point in how global countries view this alliance. The inclusion of Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia not only expands geography from Asia to the Middle East, from North Africa to the Horn of Africa, but also brings new political, financial, and energy potential. Just Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries with confrontational relations for decades, now sitting at the BRICS table is clear evidence of power shifting outside the Western framework. The presence of sanctioned, oil-rich, developing, and populous countries all coming together makes BRICS a bloc that no serious economic model or geopolitical analysis can ignore. A critical point in BRICS structural change is how newly joining countries are no longer making individual, quiet decisions with faded diplomatic significance. Many of these countries act in coordinated groups to create a common voice. West African countries apply together as a cluster. Southeast Asia is gradually showing signs of connection after several countries in the region expressed interest. Latin America, traditionally the U.S. backyard, has also held secret discussions to find an independent direction. BRICS is no longer a simple group but is becoming a strategic network. The voluntary revolution. What's truly remarkable about this global shift isn't just its size, it's how it's happening. Throughout the history of international alliances, a familiar model is often seen. Power blocs send representatives to campaign, invite, sometimes even pressure to attract more members. But with BRICS, something strange is happening. This bloc hasn't launched an expansion campaign or hung up a welcome sign. Yet, 44 countries have been and are actively seeking out BRICS, knocking on the door themselves, submitting applications, expressing wishes. Without needing an invitation, they're still lining up, not because of media attraction but something deeper. Quick question. If you were running a country, would you rather be dictated terms by the IMF or be treated as an equal partner? The answer explains everything about BRICS attraction. There's no loud marketing strategy, no lobbying campaigns. BRICS hasn't even declared it will expand into a global bloc. So what has caused dozens of countries from Africa, the Middle East to Latin America and Southeast Asia, including some that have long depended heavily on the West, to now bet on an alliance once considered faint? The answer lies in accumulated disappointment. Many countries have grown weary of queuing before financial institutions like the IMF or World Bank, where each loan comes with dozens of conditions: tightening public spending, privatizing national assets, reforming political institutions. To them, that's no longer cooperation but imposition. And when BRICS appears as a new playing field where no one is forced to change their identity, no one is forced to be like us, it quickly becomes an attractive choice. Notably, the way countries approach BRICS shows high proactivity. Many have submitted membership applications multiple times after rejection or no response. They don't wait for an invitation. They don't demand privileges. They just want a seat to speak, to exchange equally, and to escape the shadow of the financial order erected by a group of powers. Some countries don't apply individually but act in groups, like West African nations expressing intent to join BRICS as a regional cluster. They understand that together they have strategic weight. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, while many countries haven't gone public, they're closely monitoring developments and may act collectively when the time is ripe. Even some Latin American countries, a region long seen as Washington's backyard, are beginning to discuss applying for observer status or gradually negotiating bilateral trade agreements with current BRICS members. The irony is delicious. The US spent decades preaching free choice and democracy, only to watch nations freely choose something else. Talk about a plot twist. Particularly remarkable is that not just governments show interest, but businesses, financial institutions, private sectors, and even intellectual communities in these countries have begun promoting independent forums to study the BRICS model, organizing seminars and proposing participation scenarios. This shows that BRICS is no longer viewed as a fringe alliance but as a vital option for those wanting to avoid being dragged into the geopolitical competition between superpowers, or simply seeking a neutral financial space to develop. The masterminds behind the curtain. So who's really orchestrating this global power shift? Amid the wave of 44 countries simultaneously expressing wishes to join BRICS, there's something noteworthy but rarely spoken. This expansion isn't happening randomly. It's not just the result of economic crisis or disappointment with the Western financial system. Deeper, this is a strategic chess move planned, led, and executed by three familiar names on the global power board: China, Russia, and Iran. They don't declare publicly, don't organize recruitment conferences, don't send emissaries to campaign. But looking closely at what's happening behind the scenes reveals a meticulously designed expansion model where candidate countries come to BRICS not just with words but with specific economic actions, from signing trade agreements to integrating financial systems. Truth bomb. While Western media portrays BRICS as chaotic and disorganized, behind the scenes there's a masterful strategy unfolding. It's not disorganized, you're just not meant to see the organization. First is China, the country considered the economic pillar of BRICS but acting more discreetly than anyone. For many years, Beijing has been quietly preparing for this moment. Instead of calling for countries to join, China focuses on a more pragmatic strategy: financial connection before political inclusion. They sign bilateral agreements with African, Central Asian, Southeast Asian countries, all settled in renminbi. They accelerate experiments with cross-border payment systems, replacing SWIFT, and quietly integrate countries not yet BRICS members into their own supply chains and credit mechanisms. This way, when these countries apply to join BRICS, they're already part of a financial ecosystem designed by China. This shows Beijing is no longer just a BRICS member, they're the foundational architect of the new generation BRICS, not just a meeting place but a network bound by trade, finance, and economic influence. Meanwhile, Russia approaches from a different angle, bolder and somewhat more urgent. After the Ukraine war and the fierce wave of Western sanctions, Russia was pushed into isolation financially. But instead of retreating, Moscow shifted its entire strategy southward and eastward. They signed new energy agreements with India, used the ruble in transactions with Iran, and established alternative trade corridors through Central Asia. BRICS for Russia is no longer a diplomatic choice but a survival ring, a network helping them escape sanctions, access markets, and maintain global presence. But the most surprising character is Iran. Once almost completely isolated from international financial channels, Iran had to develop an underground diplomatic system relying not on conferences but alliances between sanctioned countries. Since officially joining BRICS in 2024, Iran hasn't wasted time. They immediately expanded their influence network to similarly situated countries: Syria, Venezuela, Sudan. They don't bring aid but a very clear message: join BRICS, where no one is excluded for political views. Think about it. What do you get when you combine China's economic power, Russia's resource leverage, and Iran's sanctions-defying expertise? The perfect recipe for a parallel global system. These three countries, China with its economic network, Russia with energy and geostrategic position, Iran with experience surviving under sanctions, have been and are steering BRICS expansion process in a way no traditional international organization has ever done. They're not just building external structure but creating an indigenous foundation for a BRICS that can exist without the dollar, without SWIFT, without the IMF or World Bank. A world beyond the dollar. Let's talk about what happens next. There's a truth the world acknowledges, though sometimes unspoken. The US dollar isn't just a currency but a weapon. Over 85% of global trade transactions are conducted in dollars, not because all countries want to use it but because they have no other choice. It's the mandatory language of international trade, a soft power protected by Western financial institutions from SWIFT to the IMF. But if BRICS expands to over 30 to 40 members, if these countries simultaneously switch to using domestic currencies or a common payment unit, this balance will begin to tilt and might one day collapse. This scenario, once considered unrealistic, is gradually becoming reality, no longer hypothetical. Let me blow your mind. Imagine waking up to a world where your country's economy wasn't controlled by decisions made in Washington. For most of the planet, that's the dream BRICS is selling. This year, an oil transaction between two BRICS member countries was conducted outside the SWIFT system, using a three-way payment mechanism in renminbi. That transaction might seem unremarkable, but to careful observers, it's a signal that the dollar is no longer absolute. Now multiply that transaction thousands of times. Imagine 30 countries representing half the world's population participating in that system, all agreeing to avoid the dollar. The result would be hundreds of billions of global trade dollars sucked out of the American financial system, untraceable, uncontrollable. And when that happens, the sanctioning power of the United States, what once made countries like Iran, Venezuela, Syria tremble, would become ineffective. The post-BRICS expansion world would no longer operate on the logic of the dollar as center. Instead, blocs would self-price, self-pay, and build trust through regional cooperation chains. China and Russia have long initiated this. India is also trading heavily in rupees. Turkey, Brazil, even some African countries are establishing bilateral payment channels outside the dollar. BRICS may not need to launch a common currency immediately, but if the ecosystem of domestic currency trade spreads, the dollar will lose its most dangerous weapon: monopoly. And the consequences won't stop at the trading floor. When countries no longer reserve USD, US Treasury bonds will lose their largest buyers. When no one fears being cut off from SWIFT, the US loses its pressure tool in global negotiations. When the dollar is no longer the only choice, the IMF and World Bank will have to compete, and then the conditional lending model may no longer be effective. Additionally, if BRICS expands large enough, the new development bank, NDB, of this bloc will gain more capital, more influence. And if NDB begins lending to infrastructure, energy, digital projects in renminbi, rupees, or a common currency basket, then the global financial picture will enter a new era where developing countries are no longer forced to choose between borrowing and sovereignty. The million-dollar question: how do you maintain an empire when you can no longer financially punish those who disobey? The US is about to find out. The soft power revolution. The BRICS transformation isn't limited to just economics. When people think of BRICS, most envision an economic bloc, a collection of developing countries with ambitions to change global financial rules. But viewing it solely from that angle, we miss what's happening quietly yet significantly. BRICS is forming a soft power network where countries connect not just through trade but strategic trust, something money or investment can't buy. Let's get real for a second. The West didn't dominate the world through military might alone, it was soft power that truly conquered. Now BRICS is building its own soft power arsenal. Feeling nervous yet, Washington? For decades, the West, with the US and Europe as its axis, built a soft power ecosystem comprising education, technology, law, institutions, and media. From Harvard to NATO, from SWIFT to the New York Times, every global influence tool operates by one logic: you can participate if you follow our standards. But now, BRICS is creating a different model, where power comes not from defining standards but from sharing power equally. When BRICS countries begin trading in domestic currencies, they're not just detaching from the dollar, they're building common financial trust. When the BRICS Development Bank funds infrastructure projects without forcing political reform, they're establishing a non-binding development model. And when countries in the bloc coordinate in technology, from developing digital payment platforms to integrating data, border monitoring, or digital identification, they're creating a new layer of cooperation, non-military security. BRICS isn't a military bloc like NATO, but that doesn't mean it lacks strategic depth. Economic cooperation creates interdependence. Interdependence leads to the need to protect shared supply chains. And when countries begin synchronizing technology, network systems, and digital standards, these connections themselves become soft barriers against external interference. For example, if a BRICS country faces cyber attacks or political instability, other countries, due to system linkages, will need to coordinate responses. No joint defense treaty needed, no military required. Just large enough technological and financial interdependence means one country's stability becomes the vital concern of the entire bloc. Additionally, BRICS is gradually moving towards standardizing data platforms and domestic security monitoring, from post-pandemic vaccine passport models to digital identity systems like Aadhaar in India or social credit in China. These technologies are being discussed as the basis for establishing a cross-national smart social infrastructure network. When these systems integrate and share data to BRICS standards, this bloc becomes not just an economic alliance but a global digital community operating in parallel with but independent from the West. Ask yourself, why is mainstream media so silent about this digital sovereignty movement? Because it threatens something more valuable than money, it threatens control. The battle for the future world order. We've reached the ultimate question in our exploration of this global revolution. Throughout history, the world has never operated without a power center, an axis that dictates rules, establishes norms, and imposes principles. After World War II, that role belonged to the West, led by the United States, with the dollar as the pivot and institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and NATO serving as extended arms. But today, as BRICS expands, the question is no longer who holds power but whether the world is entering a new era where absolute power has no place. Final thought experiment. What if the true conflict isn't East versus West, but centralization versus decentralization? What if BRICS isn't about replacing America, but replacing the very concept of having a single global leader? The BRICS expansion isn't simply a membership movement but a system choice. On one side is the familiar model: borrow means reform, trade means following existing standards, and development means dependence. On the other is an emerging model where countries don't need to surrender sovereignty, change systems, or be treated as second class in the world game. BRICS in its new form represents this second model. And the battle between these models, though without bombs, is raging more fiercely than ever, in diplomatic classrooms, on commodity trading boards, in each infrastructure loan package, each domestic currency payment agreement, each new trade corridor opened without passing through the dollar. Behind that is the confrontation between two ideologies, one wanting to maintain the old order at all costs, the other seeking to build a new order despite knowing the price to pay. What makes this moment different is the determination from global South countries. They no longer beg to join, they need no protection. They step forward with a clear question: why can't we rewrite the rules when we're the ones bearing the consequences of the old rules? And if the Rio Conference truly accepts the wave of 44 countries joining, that will be the historic moment when the geopolitical scale bends. A BRICS with 30 to 40 members holding over half the world's population, most strategic resources, and superior industrial production capacity would no longer be an organization, it would be a rival global system. However, no victory comes easily. BRICS may face resistance from sanctions to financial attacks to media wars aimed at reducing credibility. These challenges are real, but it's in challenges that a new order can prove itself worthy of existence. So the final question isn't for countries but for each of us, as citizens, investors, consumers. Do we want to live in a led world or a world where we can be autonomous? BRICS in this ambitious form doesn't provide the answer, but it creates a choice, an opportunity. And perhaps the most frightening thing for the old order isn't BRICS' existence but the reality that more and more people are willing to believe in a future no longer led. If you've followed to this point, please leave a comment saying, "I watched it all," to let us know you didn't miss any important details. What do you think about BRICS' future? Is this the beginning of a new order or just an ambitious dream? Leave your perspective in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, share it with those interested in geopolitics and global finance, and subscribe to the channel to not miss upcoming exciting content. Thank you for joining us and see you in the next videos.